Hello, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my almost daily COVID-19 trends live stream. I'll be covering the countries of the world and the states of the United States and the counties of California in that order. Actually, I won't probably be doing much on the counties this time because my data for some reason is a couple days out of date, and so I covered it yesterday. So look, if you want detailed information on the counties of California, I may not cover them at all today, or I'll cover them only very briefly. Look at yesterday's live stream on YouTube, and you will find that same information that I would cover if I were to cover it today. On top of that, I'm also in the process of reloading my countries dashboard here. I've just changed it so that it goes back a particular time in history, and 60 days seemed like it was too long for this graph to cope with, so I've tried to change it to 45, but I'm not sure if that actually worked. Anyway, hopefully it's loading. We may have some interesting things happening here. Maybe it'll end up being nothing but the states this time. But for now, it is the 11th, and we have data for the 11th, so at least it's up to date. It doesn't seem to be going back 45 days the way I hoped. It goes more than that, which too many days kind of chokes the graphing algorithm for some reason, and sometimes I lose my graphs, but we'll just roll with it. So as always, the United States far in the lead in total cases worldwide, way more than anyone else. However, I am always more interested in the numbers by day. What direction are we headed? Not where are we? And as we can see, the United States has a trend that is unlike some of the larger countries or more contributing countries of the world, whereas Russia it now has more daily cases than anyone but the United States. Russia is rising while the United States is falling. So the United States is recovering. It's really quite obvious now that we've peaked many weeks ago and are heading downward. In fact, the United States had an exceptionally good day. There's another data source I have. Actually, I can probably flip to it real quick. Depending on who's counting, this particular most recent day is actually the best day we've had in the United States since late March, in fewest cases since late March. My own data source, Our World in Data, does claim that there was a better day in late April, but even so, you can say that the day we've just had is very, very good. One day doesn't mean anything, but it could just be random noise, as this day probably was. But it is interesting that as we see this trend downward, our exceptional days are getting lower and lower, as are some of our exceptionally high days. So the United States really does seem to be trending downward, as the trend line indicates, and as you can generally see, though it waves around a lot, it's getting better. Not so Russia, or Brazil for that matter. For some reason, Brazil isn't showing a trend line. It may be missing some data, but it's worth taking a look at Brazil. Oh, that's not good. The reason Brazil is not showing a trend line is because, well, it is showing a trend line, but the reason we couldn't see it is that some of its recent days, 4 of the 5 most recent days, have been way above its trend line. So it's had some very bad days. The most recent day is okay. It's kind of in line with its trend before, but there's a real sign that Brazil is heading into trouble here. One day doesn't mean anything, but 4 days really starts to mean something. And so there's something's going on in Brazil. As always, maybe they're just testing a whole lot, but as I recall, they're not. So it's more likely that Brazil is having an outbreak here that is a legitimate increase in underlying infection. Russia, similarly, is having a genuine upswing in cases. Probably could always be more testing. Let's swing down to the bottom here and just see how Brazil and Russia are testing, because we have pretty good data on that. Probably. How many have they tested? Very best case of the 25 is Portugal, testing 5.5% of its population. How do Brazil and Russia compare to 5.5? We don't have anything on Brazil. That's probably not. Yeah, that's not correct. We just don't know how much Brazil's been testing. They've given us a few tiny data points, but not much. Russia, on the other hand, is testing quite well at 4% of its population, and it's accelerating. You can see it's outstripping, the dots are outstripping the trend line. So Russia is testing really very effectively right now. and speeding up. So go Russia. We don't know about Brazil. I'm sure they're not testing 0 people every day, so that's just a data question. But in both of those countries are in the top 6, 7. Brazil, we always keep our eye on, especially because they've kind of been ignoring the epidemic in some sense at the highest levels of government. We think that they may see it run away from them in a way that it hasn't in other countries that have been really taking steps, which is almost every country. But Brazil is almost unique in the way that it's treated the epidemic as, a little flu, as they call it. And maybe it is a little flu. One of these days we may find that the fatality rate is 0.1% because there are vastly more cases than we know about. That could happen. I don't think so. I think their fatality rate is actually going to be 1% or at least 0.5% when all the chips are down, and that makes it considerably worse than a typical flu. So that's Brazil. Brazil and Russia looking pretty bad. United States, not so much. It certainly didn't peak and drop away as someone like Italy did. Look at that. Look at that. Italy, which at its peak had 6,000 cases a day, now dropping and dropping and dropping, just perfectly steady. I keep waiting for this to flatten out at some point to develop a long tail, but you wouldn't know it from this graph. It looks like it's just going to hit 0 in 3 days. Suddenly there'll be no more cases in Italy. That's impossible. There's bound to be some continuation of it, but the trend downward is remarkable, and Spain is doing much the same. Spain and Italy and Europe in general have just been doing quite well. They're over it. And Turkey, again, appears to be an honorary member of Europe when it comes to COVID-19. Belgium, the Netherlands, these are all scaled because this does not adjust at this point for population. That's the next graph. But Europe, there you have it. Europe has licked this thing. The United States, not so much. Its trend line is, if it had been doing a Europe, by now we'd be almost down to 0. Shoot straight up, shoot straight down, V-shaped, upside down V-shaped. It didn't do that. I've never quite understood why. One possibility is that we're just seeing a rolling epidemic across different states, and so as one state recovers, like New York, say, or New Jersey, another state jumps into position, like Illinois with its new epidemic. But wouldn't that happen with the regions of Spain or the regions of Italy? Why did Spain and Italy rise or fall at such a steep pace, and the United States not? I don't have a good answer for that. Anyone with any guesses? Let me know. I have a request for the Dallas area. Well, I can show you Texas, but I don't have focus in this. Well, the data set could actually show it by counties of Texas, but my particular graphs do not show counties of Texas. So I'll just have to show you Texas on the next tab and hope that's satisfactory. If you want, you can reach out to me separately on YouTube and I can give you I have the ability to do a breakdown by counties of Texas. So at this point though, we're still talking countries, and let's go to the countries adjusted by population, daily cases by population. We see this very nice hilly landscape that we've been seeing for a month or more now developing, where a lot of countries peaked and quickly declined, and that's great. And then we see the exceptions. Singapore, its latest day is even higher than the rest. So there was some question for a little bit about whether Singapore might have turned the corner and be headed downward to become one of these hills. Doesn't seem to be happening. Singapore is just heading upwards. This is per capita, so it is adjusted for the relatively small size of Singapore, but as after adjusting for population, Singapore has the worst epidemic that we have seen, period, I think I can safely say, in the entire world. Spain and Italy, of course, were quite serious, but Belgium as well here, per capita, peaked at 100 people per million new cases each day. Singapore has just hit 150, and it's going strong upwards. So Singapore has a serious problem, as does Peru. Peru in that Central South America cluster that we've been talking about. Peru, Brazil, Ecuador. I think we'll see Ecuador is doing much better now, but not so Peru. Brazil might be one of these. No, this is Russia. Chile, also in the Central South America cluster. Saudi Arabia is also trending upwards. These are the countries that are shooting upwards. Brazil is not so bad per capita. It's certainly rising. It's certainly accelerating in its, well, maybe not accelerating the growth. That's what the next chart will tell us. But the number of new cases is rising each day in Brazil. But it doesn't have the steep lines we see in Singapore and Peru, or maybe even Russia. So Russia shows signs of being an epicenter for sure, but Singapore is our worst case right now, and Peru. And then lots and lots of countries that are doing very well. As we said, pretty much all of Europe. Let's take a quick peek at Sweden. Notice Sweden has dropped, if you've been watching. Sweden used to be, I think, if I remember, used to be in the top 20 at least, maybe even the top 10. But it has leveled out. Well, okay, there goes my graph. Will it load back if I load it? Sweden has leveled out. It does not show a nice hill shape. It has leveled out, but not completely, not peaked. And we focus on Sweden because Sweden has this somewhat relaxed, very deliberate. Oh, it's going to do it to me again, isn't it? Well, I don't really need to look at that anyway, said the fox to the grapes. Sweden has a relaxed opinion of it's not that they have a relaxed opinion of the epidemic. They seem to be coming from a very conscious place of feeling like they know exactly what they're doing and feeling like they're doing it exactly right. Unlike Brazil, which sometimes gives a sense of not knowing what they're doing or not really just even spending any time thinking about it. Sweden seems to have thought carefully about the epidemic and decided not to lock down. And so, as we saw briefly in that last graph before it got washed away by technological problems, Sweden has not peaked, whereas the rest of Europe as a whole peaked and went down. Sweden is still rising slowly, and it's not peaking. And so I would hope that when they sit around in their cabinet meetings or whatever their governance bodies look like, that they say, this is exactly what we wanted. We wanted to have our economy stay open. We wanted our people to be happy and go to restaurants. We wanted to have all these benefits of not locking down, and we knew this would happen. We knew we would get more cases and more deaths because of it, and that's the choice we made. I hope that's what Sweden's saying, rather than saying, oh darn, I wish we'd locked down because now look at this terrible thing happening that we never thought would happen. The lesson here, we see it some places, but not others, so it's not a really solid lesson, but at least in the case of Sweden, there's indication that the lockdowns, the stringent lockdowns, really do help to get over the epidemic sooner, which is reasonable, but there's certainly dissent on that question. And Sweden is one data point saying, yes, that helps. Right. You look at the countries as a whole, I feel it's slightly downward, maybe flat. This is the percentage of daily growth per country. The zero line is the thick horizontal line in the middle here, in the middle of this rope. We don't have a lot of sharply upward sloping lines here. The worst is Chile. Not super sharply upwards and not super fast growing at 8% per day, but that's still a substantial daily growth. We don't have too many other that are accelerating in that way. We do have quite a lot of countries that are still growing, though. Pakistan, India, Mexico, all of these having new cases every day. Saudi Arabia. And we have one more in the top 25, Iran, that is heading upwards, accelerating. 4% daily growth and rising. So really, it's just Chile and Iran that seem to have the problems, the worst problems. And we've seen so much worse, so this is good. But there still are a lot of countries that are growing and have not crossed that zero line, have not turned the corner towards negative daily growth. One good one here is Singapore. As we saw, Singapore has a lot of cases per capita and has been a new epicenter. However, right now, in the very latest data on the rope chart, what I love about the rope chart is it doesn't just look at the total or even the dailies, but it actually gives a real sense of where things are headed. And Singapore's growth rate has been shrinking and is now past zero about a week ago. And now Singapore is seeing 4% fewer new cases every day. That should fairly soon give us a peak and a downward turn on what now looks like a very sharp upward trajectory in daily cases. And then eventually that will lead to a flattening out of the total cases. So Singapore is certainly one of the biggest per capita epicenters of the world, but at least they have one of the best trends away from that. They're trending towards negative daily growth, fewer and fewer cases every day. And generally, that's true of a lot of the world. If we were to zoom in here, I'm almost guarantee you this is all Europe, or mostly Europe, and Turkey. We have Europe as a whole is doing 5% fewer cases each day and slightly accelerating. In the case of Ireland, it's somewhat rapidly accelerating. In the case of Ecuador, by the way, that's our other outlier. Ecuador was a real problem about 2 weeks ago. We were seeing it way up in all the graphs, and now Ecuador shrinking 15% a day, definitely getting over this thing, having crossed that zero line towards negative growth weeks ago. So Ecuador was the epicenter of the new epicenter in Central South America, now is recovering, clearly recovering. And that's about the news for the countries. There's not a huge amount of excitement around the countries. There's Europe, as always, getting better. We'll look at the United States, I guess, because I do think everyone watching this practically is in the United States. The United States is looking okay. It's got a negative 2% growth. It's very slightly shrinking every day in new cases, and that line is downward, so it's that we might see 3% in a couple days shrinkage and 4% in a couple more days, a very slight increase in the rate at which it's shrinking. So the United States is doing all right. It's not growing at all. It's actually shrinking, and that shrinkage is accelerating. Looking at the whole world, the cases for the whole world are still slightly rising, new cases, but it's fairly plateau-ish. We could imagine this actually is really a plateau that this trend line just hasn't caught up with, just a very noisy plateau. And if we look at the percent change worldwide, as you would expect in a plateau, zero change day to day on average. It wavers around that zero line, but the world is stable in the number of daily new cases. It's not getting more and more cases, but it's also not shrinking away. So the world is hanging in the balance between recovery as a world and a new epidemic. And I think it'll head towards recovery just from what we're seeing in all the countries as they all recover. And there's a trend away from apparent recovery because these are the reported cases, and the whole world is testing much, much more. And so we're getting more reported cases as previously unknown cases come to light through higher testing. So if we actually could graph the underlying infection rate, I think that would be sharply down, maybe even. What we're really seeing is the pull of testing, pulling that back up towards the positive, not because we're getting more and more cases, but because we're finding more cases. Can't prove that from this data, but that's been this sort of competing hypothesis we've had here for a couple of weeks, and things are looking a little better now, suggesting that that if the testing hypothesis is true, if these slight rises we've seen over the past couple of weeks are due to the much higher and accelerating rate of testing, then we're starting to turn that corner as well and head towards negative growth as we catch all the cases, or most of them, and are able to quarantine and trace them. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case if we see a sharp downward turn in the next few days. Just next few days, it could happen where we may have reached a tipping point and suddenly we just fall off the plateau. That would be cool. We may see one day of that. As I mentioned, we're seeing just one day. One day isn't enough to say anything, but if that's true, we could see that this sharp downward trend we've seen for a couple days. We could see that trend downward for forever, and we'll just be over it, at least the first wave. That would be nice. I'm not going to predict that, but that would be what would happen if we really aren't seeing new infections, but we are seeing vastly improved testing. So, as for testing, in the top 25 countries, Portugal continues to do well, though there's something strange happening there. What happened to the latest data points of Portugal? Okay, we just don't know. Portugal for a week hasn't reported. We don't have data, but they were doing great before, and there's no reason to believe that they've suddenly stopped testing. So Portugal probably still leading in testing. Italy doing very well. Switzerland. Who is this? Belgium. Belgium doing very well in testing. Yeah, and Belgium also shows this thing we see when testing suddenly accelerates. We see lines above the trend, dots above the trend line, which just means the trend line can't quite grasp yet that there's been such a radical change in the shape of the trend. Any 5-year-old will tell you this is the trend line, but this particular nonlinear fit doesn't know what to do with it. And plus, there are these days down here that certainly don't help either in trying to figure out where the real trend line is. But this is the real trend line. Belgium is above 4% at this point, and that's good. Anything above 1% is quite good. Countries as a whole doing well in testing, and a lot of them seem to be accelerating. Let's look at the states. I'm going to reload this just to give my poor graphing library a hope of not failing on me immediately. New York shows this delightful 3 or 4 points below the trend line that indicates that it's rapidly decelerating. Usually this graph is not interesting because not enough happens on it, but we can see a very interesting, very strong trend here in that these are so far below the trend line, indicating that New York is really seeing a recovery here. To a lesser degree, New Jersey. Let's just go straight to daily per capita, though. New daily cases per capita. Yeah, all right. There are some really weird points way above this zoom window that I don't think I'm going to bother with. But we'll just see what the trend line should capture those. New York. Still the worst. No one has surpassed New York even per capita. New York was the worst per capita. New Jersey also quite bad. Rhode Island, but all of those are recovering, and New York is showing that Italy-like decline that I just wish we could see in California or in the world or in the United States. Again, I'm just wildly guessing that may happen when you have homogeneity of population, where you don't have something like Kansas and California and New York, but where you have a single homogeneous, well-mixed population, then they really do peak and quickly decline. That seems reasonable to me that would happen. Whereas somewhere like California, which is not quite so homogeneous. You have quite different sections of California. California hasn't even peaked, much less is it declining evenly. And the United States as a whole, as we saw, is not declining. Well, it's declining evenly, but not declining swiftly. Worth noting, though, I kind of don't mention this often enough, I think. If you look at it per capita, we spend a lot of time talking about California. I'm in California right now, and Joby Aviation that funded this is in California, and people listening to it in California. So there's a focus for sure on California in this live stream. And if we did the next tab, it would be all about California. But when you look at the big picture, I'm going to flash California here. New York at its worst did 400 some new cases every day per million population. California here, if I flash it, is just in the noise at the very bottom. It is, in some sense, doing great. We focus in on the graph, it's like, oh, it's rising, it's not dropping. But on the other hand, it's never begun to touch the heights of any of these states. California, remember 400. New Jersey, New York were in the range of 400. California, yes, it's rising, but it's still at 50, not 400. It's at an eighth of the worst ones. Here's a comparison. So the shape of California's curve is disturbing. but the height of it per capita is not. California is doing very well compared to just about everyone else. It has very few cases, given its population. All right, now let's look at Illinois, because Illinois is lots of fun. Illinois has been giving us something exciting to talk about for some days now, where all these other states are peaking and dropping away, peaking and dropping away, peaking and dropping away. We see that with all of these, all the 5 big ones here. Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, big in a certain sense. Per capita cases, Rhode Island is a big state. New Jersey, New York, all of them peaking and dropping away visibly, not just in growth rates on the rope chart, but visibly dropping away by actually we can see they're seeing fewer and fewer new cases, and their trend lines are starting to reflect that. Then you've got Illinois and Maryland and Iowa. Let's just look at those 3. Illinois, Maryland, where are you, Maryland, and Iowa. These are 3 that are rising. Now again, recall 400 is as high as anyone's gotten. It's totally believable, totally plausible that we could see any of these lines hit 400. Maryland probably less likely than the others, but the other 2 are already halfway there and still rising. Illinois keeps rising. Iowa keeps rising. We'll see on the rope chart whether there's a tendency for them to accelerate upwards, or whether there's a trend for them to be heading back downwards. So they may not, probably will not hit 400, my guess, just because we have a lot more capacity, and New York can send test kits to other places now, and people and all this. So I think we'll probably get a handle on Illinois and Iowa in a way that we didn't on New York. But per capita, they're in pretty bad shape. They're rising, they haven't peaked, and they just keep rising. And we have a few others. Minnesota actually is notable right now. Doesn't have a huge number of cases, but it's rising sharply. Now let's look at the rope chart. One thing when I just first look at this, something that's notable to me is we have 4 days in a row here where there are a whole lot of dots below 0. And each of these dots is a 7-day moving average. This is the 7-day average of percent change for a particular state. So in the most recent 4 days, we're seeing a real pull downward from a lot of states. It's not really obvious in the graph yet because we're using, it takes these lines a while to register when something is heading downward. But if we were to look at almost any of these states, most of these states, we would see that the most recent days all are showing negative growth, or at least a lot of recent days are showing negative growth. So that's a good sign. It's 4 days in a row, and each one of those days is an average of 7 days, the 7 days preceding it. So there's a hint here that though we don't see it yet in the rope chart quite, there's a hint here that we're going to see some downward pull from all of these, or many of these states. I would say that the rope chart is looking a little better than it has. We see a lot of states that are below and heading downward. Maybe half of them are below 0, so they're seeing fewer and fewer cases each day, and they're trending downward. We also see a few states that are trending upwards. Minnesota right now, which has just popped into the top 25, is certainly our worst, with a 10% growth rate and slightly rising. We'll just watch that. It has a relatively small number of cases, so it's not going to be a serious factor nationwide probably, but that's Minnesota right now. Arizona, also troublesome, 5% growth in daily cases and rising. And then we see Colorado. I'm going to zoom in on Colorado again. Colorado had a period where the data was pretty bad, and not in the sense of bad news, but just it was missing. We have had this whole stretch of days in Colorado where we didn't get data reported at all, and now it's caught up. I would say, eyeballing it, that this trend line is about correct. There's one really large point I'll just pull out so we can see it way up here, which probably was the reporting of all 6 of those days together. But broadly speaking, Colorado seems to be growing in daily new cases. And the rope chart says, in fact, that it thinks Colorado is accelerating in daily new cases. I don't quite know if that's true because of those 5 weird days, but Colorado isn't doing great. It's maybe holding steady. And since it is one of the 2 states that opened up particularly early, we've been keeping an eye on Colorado. The other one is Georgia, which is doing better, much better. Georgia is showing an 11% drop in daily new cases over the past 7 days, and that is accelerating. So we couldn't ask for better than what we're seeing in Georgia. And in fact, I think Georgia may be the very best state in the top 25 right now, just barely beating out New York, which of course is doing tremendously well. So Georgia, in spite of the slightly lax way that it opened up, seems to be doing great. So there's a counterpoint to the Sweden example. You can't necessarily compare Georgia and Sweden, but those are 2 cases where lockdowns weren't as severe as people thought they should be. Sweden seems to be paying for it. Georgia doesn't. Georgia seems to be doing great. So Georgia, someday we'll have a huge analysis of all the states and what they did and when they did it and what effect it had. But for now, all we can say is here's a data point that says maybe we don't need to lock down as much as we have. Iowa also has suddenly turned a corner and is sharply downward. And a lot of these states are slightly downward. California, as we saw, I think, maybe we haven't looked at California. California's doing okay, 1% growth rate, so it's still slightly up, but it's pretty flat there. 1%, obviously not a huge growth rate, though over a period of a year, that's hundreds of percent. So it can't stay there without it becoming a real problem. It's got to drop below 0 before we can get over this, but at least it's not trending upwards. And then we have others, Arizona. Who is this? That is Colorado. No one's looking terrible other than Arizona, which is above 5%, in Montana, or Minnesota, which is small and a small number of cases suddenly bursting on the scene. Those tend to be outliers, and they quickly rejoin the pack. So Minnesota will either disappear from this list entirely if its cases start to shrink, or it will probably rejoin the pack and turn downward and trend back towards 0. Generally, we're seeing the state graph look better than it has, though. More states appear to be down below 0, shrinking, than are above. And the ones that are below 0 are mostly, actually they're all trending even farther downwards. The ones that are above 0, we have only maybe 5 that are still accelerating upwards. The rest of the ones that are above 0 are heading towards 0, so that's good. The states are looking pretty good. Let's take a moment to look at testing by state. Rhode Island, as always, home of CVS, is doing very well. New York, 6% population tested, doing really well. Massachusetts, doing very well. Louisiana, Tennessee, all 4%. Everyone's above 1% in the top 25 at least. Everyone is, do we have it? Yes, we do. Everyone's accelerating with very few exceptions. All these lines are trended upwards, which means that states not only are testing more and more people, they're testing more and more each day. On average, they test more each day than they did the previous day. And Rhode Island, for instance, is testing 0.3% of its population every day. Every 3 days, they test 1% of their population. So what is that? In a year, they've tested everyone. No one else is doing quite that, but Massachusetts is doing well and accelerating. New York is doing well and accelerating. California, well, let's see. So again, 0.3% is extraordinarily good. California is doing 0.1%. So it's all right. 1/10. 1/10 is right around here. This is probably, there's California right there. There are a lot of states doing worse than California. A lot of them. California is now maybe in the top 10. So, and again, pull back from my California-centric view. When you look at the per capita, California is doing well overall, just in that it has very few cases per capita. So things look pretty good with California. At this point, normally I'd go to the county's view. I'll just show it real quick, but it is the same one that I showed before, so I don't have any real news on the counties. I'll just say, as always, Los Angeles, again, this is 2 days, this is old news, 2 or 3 days ago. As of then, Los Angeles still had far more cases than anyone else. Per capita, Imperial continued to be bizarrely dominant. Kings and Tulare also very strongly upwards. Los Angeles still growing, but not at a super fast pace. But you've heard all this if you've been watching. Tune into yesterday's if you want to know more about the counties of California, because this is old news. Hopefully tomorrow my data set will catch up. I'll be able to give you something better. Actually, I'm probably not going to be doing tomorrow. There's some sort of conflict. I forget what it is, but maybe I'll be back on Wednesday, or maybe tomorrow, who knows. Especially if something dramatic happens, I may show up at least briefly tomorrow. But yeah, the news for the states is looking a little better, because I'd say significantly better. And if this really is a testing thing that's had us see this downward and then upward sweep here as of about 3 weeks ago, if that really was us exceeding our testing capacity, or rather building our testing capacity to the point that it exceeds demand, if that really is what's happened, so that we're testing people just whenever they feel like it, and we're getting more and more tested in people who don't have symptoms and all that, and that's why we're catching more people who we didn't even know about, then that's great, and that may be why we're starting to see the testing pulling these graphs downward. If so, that again could be a matter of just days before we see some sharp changes. But I'm not going to predict that. I'm just saying it could happen. What I will say, though, is right now the states are looking pretty good. They're trending in the right direction. The broad picture is slightly downward, which is sure better than it used to be, even just a few days ago, where we didn't know what was going on, but we knew that the trends weren't looking good. Now we can see the trends are looking slightly good. And in the case worldwide, also trends are looking slightly good. So a little more evidence that we may be turning back around to trend downward and get over this thing as a world and as a country. And hopefully, once my data comes back online, hopefully we'll also see that as a state we're doing that, as California. That's the news for today. My name's Greg Farrar, and thanks for watching.